Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Present Fly podcast, joined by Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson. We're here to discuss about the trucker insurgency, which began in Canada and is extended to the rest of the Anglo-Sphere, the USA, the UK, and Australia. So we'll start with you, Swithun. Why don't you sort of talk about the rise of the trucker insurgency here?
Well, I have my trucker hat, so as close as I can to a trucker hat on now. So, what was the whole thing with the truckers about? Well, it started early January as a convoy and as kind of like a sit-in protest to a vaccine mandate imposed predominantly, it would seem, on interstate truckers between Canadian states, long distance ones, and also those who go to America. And basically, these truckers had essentially had enough with all the coronavirus mandates and restrictions. So it ostensibly starts with the vaccine mandate on them, but it also extends to masking, distancing, and the whole host of coronavirus types of legislation. As to why it's truckers and why it's not any other section of the public is an interesting question. But like many of the heroes that we had in 2020, they probably got fed up of going, oh wait, the heroes, yeah, you did all this stuff and put your neck on the line, right? You got to do what we say all the time, otherwise you lose your job. It's like, what? So with similar mandates, so they stopped in England. They didn't do a protest like that, for instance, with there was a mandate on nurses and doctors to have the coronavirus vaccine, which they then stopped in England because they were going to lose like a few 100,000 staff. Because no, we're not having it. So they probably got fed up with that. Anyway, so it starts in early January. Everybody in the mainstream media ignores it. And it's like, oh no, there's this little trucky thing over there. No one cares about it. Someone asked Justin Trudeau, oh, they're all racist extremists. They're fringe. No one cares about them. And then slowly but surely, they became bigger and bigger with more and more trucks. And they've gone more and more and more support. I mean, it's got so big in Canada. I can't remember where this one is, but I think it's in Ottawa that they're trying to declare a state of emergency now so they can try and get rid of them because they're causing so much disruption, which of course they are causing some disruption, but relative to, well, their position would be relative to what the central governments did in 2020. Well, you can still go to work. It might be a little bit more difficult, but you can still go. So the Canadian government has been trying to shut this down, so much so that they got to, they basically got GoFundMe because they were being funded primarily by crowdfunding on GoFundMe originally. But then they decided, oh no, I think it was something to do with foreign donors, and they couldn't determine where the money had come from. It might be money laundering or something. Probably came from Russia, or because that's where all the bad things come from. And so they pulled it. But not only did GoFundMe stop distributing the donations to them, GoFundMe tried to steal all the money. At which point everyone went, "What? You're supposed to just give the donations back?" And eventually, after public pressure, they relented, and now they're using a predominantly Christian crowdfunding site called Give Send Go, who then another judge, I think on Thursday, to say, oh no, they must stop sending donations. And Give Send Go said, no, we will. We're just going to keep going. The Canadian government have stolen firewood from them because they're living in trucks and trying to keep warm with firewood. So they instructed the police to basically steal their wood. They made it illegal for anyone to give aid to them and give them fuel in red jerry cans, so much so that everybody in those areas started walking around with red jerry cans, some with fuel in, obviously, but others just with water, and drank them in front of the police. So the police have absolutely no idea which of these have fuel in, because there's so many of them. There's just no way of knowing. And this has now obviously become a really big thing in Canada, and it's been covered on the mainstream news. I mean, there's that big bridge, I think, between America and Canada, which is basically completely blocked. We say, oh, it's nothing to do with the truckers. It's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure it has. And so it's making waves. There's been copy version convoys in sort of Australia. There's even been in England as well. They tried to do it in France as well, but they stopped them outside Paris, saying, oh no, they're going to cause too much disruption in Paris. So for what was allegedly sort of like a little fringe racist bunch of truckers, has garnered a lot more support and is going international. Some of the states in Canada, and I can't remember which ones, have started to say, oh yeah, we're going to get rid of our restrictions now, no mandates, and masks and stuff are going to go by March, but not all of them have. And of course, Trudeau is holding fast the strong line that he's a great sort of like strongman leader and can put down this rebellion. Although he did leave the Parliament building in Canada after they got some relatively strong questioning about his current vaccination mandate policy, and got roundly booed by the opposition. So that's a sort of a potted history of the truckers and the influence it's had worldwide so far.
Right. So one thing I'd like to open up with here is, if other than the obvious that these people don't know what they're doing in charge at the top, if there is a plan, what might that plan be? And I think the best way to understand what's going on is in light of what Andrew Yang said in 2019 and 2020 during the Democratic primaries, that there was this push to roll out automated trucks that would displace the truckers. And his whole shtick was, well, I'm not going to do that if you elect me as president of the United States. So if the government just, or corporations just fire these people for automated trucks, they would look like the bad guys. There'd be a huge national outcry against them for doing that. I think what we can guess at is that they're sort of so what they're trying to do is discredit the truckers and get them out of the picture by making the truckers look like the bad guys, by not living up to the health mandates. And you don't want Canada or Americans to be safe. You want to kill them. You don't want to be vaccinated. And so that's the way they can sideline the truckers. Now, whether they have these robot trucks ready to go right now, whether that's 5 years down the road, is an open question. But I think what they are doing is they are priming the pump for this. And furthermore, I think they would rush the trucks if they had to, because I'm sure they've done, like, quote unquote war game scenarios where, prototype trucks crashing and braking, killing innocent bystanders, and figuring out how to handle that. Because ultimately they don't want to have these truckers on the road because you can't control them. They're not reliable. They might do this. So Keith, what are your thoughts on that explanation?
Well, I do know that from the technological end, there are a lot of efforts underway to develop self-driving cars and self-driving trucks, and they've actually started to experiment with that in places. I know in Europe they've had a few test models where they sent out these self-driving trucks to drive across the European continent, basically delivery trucks. Now, I actually read up on that issue of self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles and that kind of stuff, and where it is. As to how it does look like that's something that's coming in the future. As to how that ties into the political situation, I think if that were introduced, it would certainly exacerbate class conflict quite a bit. I know some time ago, probably a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I saw a commentary by Tucker Carlson where he was talking about that. He was saying that if you replace truck drivers with self-driving trucks, you would essentially, in the United States alone, put 10 million people out of work. So that would be an extraordinarily large number of people who'd be out of work. And these are people who are part of the traditional working class as well. So I think that would really exacerbate class conflict quite a bit, because a lot of the conflicts that we see in the Western world today, not just in America, but everywhere in all the Western democracies, as Thomas Piketty has shown, are basically the traditional working to middle class, that is the industrial working class and associated others, against the new elites, against the tech oligarchs and the professional class and that kind of thing. And something like eliminating the livelihoods of tens of millions of people through technological means would certainly exacerbate that, I think, to a significant degree. I mean, it would be like in the Industrial Revolution, when machinery was developed and you had peasants would go out and smash up the machinery because it was destroying their livelihoods, and then of course they'd retaliate by hanging peasants for smashing up industrial machinery. And I think we would be faced with something comparable to that in many ways. So and this situation may be a prelude to that. Although I think that one thing that's going on with the with the truckers and all that is it shows how hated the elites are in many countries. Because what I've noticed is that the pandemic situation has really, really brought that out. Like people in Western countries who are disinclined to, who are inclined to dislike the current crop of elites we have in the Western world are usually, not always, but usually the same people who are skeptical about vaccine mandates and lockdowns and things like that. Now, that's not entirely the case. And it's not just a left-right thing either. But I have noticed that. That the very fact that the establishment has pushed the vaccine so aggressively by itself makes a lot of people skeptical of it, or the fact that the current crop of elites has pushed the lockdown so aggressively, that makes a lot of people skeptical of it by nature. So I think that a lot of this is political. It's not even about health issues or any of that kind of stuff. As far as the situation with the truckers, I think that for a lot of those people, this kind of thing is probably reflective of just a wider set of grievances they have against the system generally. They just look at it like, well, this vaccine mandate is just the last straw. We're not going to take this. And this is just something that's piled on top of a lot of other things. It's not that they just all of a sudden said, yeah, I just can't bear the thought of having a vaccine passport. I think it was sort of like a spark that lit the kindling that was all, there was already a big pile of kindling there to start with.
All right, Swithun.
Well, I certainly think that a lot of people are being very angry with how the whole thing has been handled over the last nearly 2 years now. And the vaccine mandates are of a sort of like the one step too far, which has just got them out in force as a rallying call. I do think that that is largely the case. As to why the Canadian government have been deliberately sort of playing hardball with them in the way that they have been, I think one of the reasons they are isn't possibly because of self-driving autonomous trucks, although that could be down the line. But I can't see that happening for a number of years, probably at least 5. They probably think that, well, they're relatively low-skilled individuals. We can just import the third world to replace them without too much difficulty. Therefore, we don't need to compromise with them. We can just play hardball, which is why we've got to this situation now in which, well, the truckers are perfectly happy to play hardball. We'll see who blinks first, and it seems like some of the Canadian state governments have blinked. As to how far this goes is another question. But it, as Keith pointed out, I do think that 2020 as a whole has radicalized a lot of people against the current ruling elite. In our early 2021 episode, the predictions for I can't remember the year in review. I can't remember which one. It was either the front end or the back end of 2021 or 2022. I predicted an increase in quote unquote right wing terrorism, just because the number of now, to be fair, it could be any terrorism actually, but I do think specifically sort of more anti-government types, I think you could be getting sort of like not a rebirth, but a rise of the militia movements and things. Just because so many people are just completely pissed off. I mean, Trudeau's attitude is the best example of this. It's not like you would think that Trudeau would have said, "We understand your concerns about vaccine mandates, but for the good of the country, that we have the vaccine because it's 97% effective, or just reduce the percentage after each week when they say it. But hey, it's a big enough percentage enough time when they say it. 75%. This will reduce the strain on the hospital, and then this is just a way of getting everyone back to normal in Canada. They just need to do that. Why does Trudeau go out of his way to go, oh no, look, all these evil, horrible yokels who deliver the stuff to me, I despise them. And it's like, what? Why even do that? I mean, it either thinks that the current upper middle class metropolitan types are so convinced of their own power, and that they couldn't really be challenged, that they can just say what they think in public about the middle and working classes. Or it could be a cynical attempt to garner support from his sort of acolytes, but I don't see why they would need to. Because everyone will go on board with it anyway, because I say the media tried to completely ignore it to begin with. So just play the reasonable card, which he didn't. So I think it just shows the contempt, and I think this widening of class divisions, as Keith said, is just going to get larger and larger. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to see what the turnout for the next election's like. They could be high or they could be low. I don't expect they'll be average. And to what extent people might just even give up on poll. Well, the interesting thing would be if people just are fed up so much that basically the voting rates go down so low that the ruling class can cease to use the elections as a legitimizing event, or at least not to the same extent as they have done historically. Whether we get there soon or not, I don't know, but that's certainly a possible result.
Now, a couple of things here. First of all, Keith, it looks like King Lud is on the march again, if what you're saying is right. But the other thing is, given the rapidity at which the trucker protest symbolism spread to the United States, to Australia, to the UK, and given also the sort of hardline stance that the governments are taking, especially in Australia and Canada, on all this, is this kind of like the 1991 moment where the Eastern Bloc fell due to massive civil protests across East Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union? Because you do sort of get that feeling that, or like 1789, where the French regime is so disconnected from the people that Marie Antoinette says, "Let them eat cake," as if she doesn't know they're already starving. And the point is, though, because what would explain this radical, heavy-handed behavior? To me, it speaks of a kind of desperation. The idea that things aren't going as planned. We're running out of time. We have to consolidate what we have so that we can weather the storm of what's coming. In this case, the storm being popular discontent. And the other thing is, it's really hard to gauge the popular discontent at the moment, right? Because prior to Charlottesville, prior to the massive censorship campaign by Google, Facebook, and Twitter, we could see all sorts of alternative news, all sorts of dissonant outlets, and you could get a pretty good thermometer temperature of the room of dissonant ideas across the spectrum, right and left. That's all gone now. And all the news outlets have seemed to be consolidated, that they all have the same messaging. And so it's really difficult to tell, other than seeing what's actually happening on the ground, how discontented people are. But this makes me think that they're more discontented than is being let on, because why are they cracking down so harshly? Why are they being so unreasonable? I'll hand that over to you, Keith.
Well, I think there's a lot of things that feed into this. As far as the pandemic situation itself, I've noticed that at least in the United States, and I think in a number of other countries, they started to ease up on a lot of the restrictions. And in the United States, even in the blue zones, which have been some of the most zealous for the pandemic restrictions, they're starting to ease up a bit. And I think that what they're worried about there is political fallout. I think they're worried that, you've got the midterm elections coming up this year, and then last year you saw in Virginia, you saw Youngkin beat McAuliffe. You had sort of an upset election, and I think a lot of the political class and from that end of the spectrum is getting concerned about that. They're thinking that the mandates and lockdowns and all that kind of stuff related to the pandemic are unpopular. People have decided they've had enough of that, and they're worried about what the political ramifications are going to be. I think another thing is that the hypocrisy of the elites has been really exposed. There was the incident with Boris Johnson a while back. There's been a lot of incidents like that of prominent public figures who have been zealous about lockdowns and mandates and masks and all this kind of stuff, more or less saying, well, one rule for you, another rule for me. That's happened to a lot of places. That happened with Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, who's a very unpopular figure. And it's happened with a lot of folks. Also, the fact that so more and more dishonesty keeps getting revealed. Initially last year or 2 years ago when this started, they were saying no, masks don't work. Then they were going to saying, oh yeah, you've got to wear a mask. Mask mandates everywhere. Now they're pulling back from that, saying, well, maybe masks don't work after all. Then there was the controversy about where did the coronavirus come from? Well, first it was from the Chinese laboratory. Oh no, it's not from the Chinese laboratory. Now they're like, oh yeah, maybe it was. It's obvious that the people running all this don't have any credibility at all. At best, they're just doing it haphazardly and piecemeal and trying to make it all up. And I think more and more people, particularly people who see their own livelihoods and that kind of thing threatened by all of this stuff, they look at it like, we've had enough. With the vaccines, I think a lot of people now, the majority of people have been vaccinated, at least in the United States, and they look at it like, okay, I got my vaccine. If other people don't want it, fine, that's on them, And then, and same thing with people who aren't getting vaccinated. They're like, no, I just don't want the vaccine. So more and more people just seem to be over all this. You still got your COVID Karen types, who want to maintain the lockdown for the next 100 years or whatever. But it's, but I think that's the real issue. A lot of people are just getting tired of this, and then elites are in a position where they're getting concerned about popular discontent. They don't, because even before all this started, we were starting to see an increase in riots and civil unrest and that kind of stuff. And then of course that's been increased by an order of magnitude during the time of the pandemic. And I do think that increasingly elites are worried about losing control.
Yes, Swithun.
I think one of the reasons why they're having to crack down on this kind of stuff so heavily is the whole messaging of the world powers, particularly the Western powers, is how do we get out of the pandemic? TM, the vaccine. It is the one savior. Every other form of treatment had to be demonized so that everybody would accept the one hope. And this is how they got vaccination rates as high as they did. Any alternative off-label use of any other type of drug was tried to suppress to all possible turns, unless Fauci decided it was a good thing because you could use it in hospitals, like remdesivir. Don't use anything outside it because that means you can't go into hospital and therefore you can't get paid because coronavirus patients got more money, etc. So the whole of the setup, and in particular places like Australia, which is basically a prison camp again, although I get the impression that the original colonial prison camps were much more open than the current prison camp in Australia. They have to have enough people vaccinated so that there is no control group in the population that you can do long-term stuff on and go, was this actually a good idea? If you can get enough people vaccinated, even if there's a small proportion of the population seem a lot healthier than the others, go, statistically insignificant, not a problem. You can't have a situation whereby there's a significant minority in the population who are unvaccinated, And now I'm not saying this necessarily will happen, but if it did happen to be the case that the unvaccinated there had, on average, better health outcomes for a whole host of different things than the vaccinated ones, in retrospect, this is going to make everything look interesting. Now, of course, you can still say, oh, yes, but we needed to get it over the pandemic hurdles or whatever. But they seem to be backpedaling on this. I mean, if you look at the date, Israel recently hit their highest coronavirus daily deaths rate. And they're on like 4 boosters. No, it's not 4, sorry, not 4 jabs, not 4 boosters, not on 7 yet. Although I'm pretty sure it was a guy in Germany who had about 7. He just kept going. He thought more was better. But he just simply has failed. But you can't make it look like it's failed, because then the whole thing makes zero sense. Because I did something really pointless, which was email my MP and said, look, message the Department of Health. Look, the whole strategy seems to be based on a vaccine will save us. What if it doesn't? What do you do? To which obviously I get no response. I mean, he sends the email to, and I get something that bears no resemblance to any of my questions, because otherwise it makes absolutely zero sense. Otherwise, it's basically, yeah, we could have shut down for 3 weeks, and then frankly, if everyone dies, they die. You can't do much about it. But the whole thing is predicated on this, and this is why the vaccine stuff is so important, and probably one of the reasons why they've got compulsory vaccinations in Austria, and they also have a vaccine unvaccinated tax in Greece, or at least they were thinking of bringing it in. If you're over the age of 50 and you didn't have one, you had to pay a fine each month, which is basically your payment for not taking the drug. It's basically a shakedown of the drug dealers. If you don't take the drug, you got to pay us. Okay, here's some money. So I think that's the reason why they've gone so heavily on it. Because if the vaccine seems like it either especially if it makes things worse in the long run, and doesn't make that much difference, even in the short run, then this is going to discredit them a whole set, and especially in Australia, where they've been utterly mental. And it is right to keep pointing out, the restrictions are coming off. I mean, in England, the last of the compulsory restrictions, Boris said he wants to lift at the end of February. Now, there's still guidance and still a bunch of bedwetters that follow it, and there's loads of them. But they are coming off. Now, what will continental Europe do? I don't know. But I think it's a case of just trying to get as much compliance in before they just basically everything has to go more towards normal. Of course, they'll be preparing pandemic 2 at some point, because they know they can get away with it, so they'll try it again. Though maybe not too soon. That might be a little bit too early. But I think that's the reason they've gone after it, because the whole thing has been predicated around the vaccine TM. And that's why they had to do it.
Well, you know what I think would also be interesting here is looking at how specifically the truckers, but also how the truckers are a response to this entire COVID takeover would be from both a sort of like classic leftist anti-capitalist analysis and then the libertarian. So, you know, this would obviously from like a leftist perspective be seen as a proletariat uprising against the truckers being the proletariat, a proletariat uprising against big capital and its state lackeys trying to displace them, either with immigrants or trucks, whatever that happens to be. And that this whole COVID scam was just one giant big pharma, psyop to get like billions and trillions of dollars because of state government mandates. And that just completely depressed and ruined the economy, such that the truckers, for various contingent historical facts, were the first proletariat to rise up. That, I think, is what a leftist analysis would be. I think a libertarian analysis would be that, well, these are basically hardworking entrepreneurial types trying to make, money for their families and just get by. And basically the government is, dinkering and meddling with the economy yet again. And, once the flood, reaches its peak, it recedes, but it never recedes to before where the flood was. So the COVID was an excuse to gain more and more central government power. And while it recedes a little bit, it's never going to recede all the way back. And then the argument would be that the truckers are the first to, rise up against this, because they're the first ones to have to deal with the passport crossing between borders. And then the further analysis would be that these passports are part of a Soviet era Stasi style, where are your papers? I can't even leave my home kind of thing. That would be the libertarian analysis. So Keith, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know that either one of those are entirely wrong. I do think, though, that it gets back to what I was saying earlier, as somebody that's interested in conflict theory and class conflict and power elites and how they work and that kind of thing. I think that to understand conflicts that we see in the Western world today, which is where this stuff is going on, again, I think Thomas Piketty really identified the root of the problem. Thomas Piketty, for those who don't know, is a French economist, and he's definitely on the left. I think he identifies as a socialist, or at least a social democrat. And he's popular with a lot of left anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal types. But he and his associates did a study of class voting patterns in 21 Western democracies. And what he found is that in all of them, except there were two where there was some gray area, but in 19 countries that they looked at, they found that the left-right dichotomy is primarily defined nowadays by they use an analogy to India and the different castes the major castes that you have in Indian culture, where they say that the left parties are now the parties of what they call the Brahmins, which means basically the intellectuals and scholarly class and priest, which, I guess we have our own secular priesthood in the professional class and all that kind of stuff. And the right-wing parties tend to be the parties of the merchants, the traditional business class, particularly the smaller business class, and also what the Hindis call the Sudras, which are like the working class, which is like the upper strata, traditional kind of proletariat industrial worker types. And that's really how the class breakdown tends to be manifested in contemporary societies. And with the rise of the digital revolution and big tech and the tech oligarchs, they have become part of the Brahmin class. The tech oligarchs are part of the Brahmin class. Michael Lind talks about this as a conflict between what he calls the big rich and the lesser rich. Like the big rich are like the new tech and financial and hedge fund oligarchs, and then the lesser rich are like more just the traditional business class, your chamber of commerce types and that kind of stuff. But you do see that nowadays. You see this strong breakdown if you look at how class voting patterns play out between the traditional working class and more the traditional business class on one side, and the new capitalist class, or tech oligarchs or financial oligarchs, and the professional class, the Brahmins, on the other side. And in the United States, race is an outlier because the poor black people and so forth are kind of like the Dalits of India. They're like they're traditionally, they were not just a class, they were a caste. So that is an outlier. But again, like I was saying earlier, I think the real thing that's been interesting about the way people have responded to the pandemic is how someone's position on the pandemic is almost entirely predictable based on their political views. Like if they are right-leaning or Republican-leaning, they're much more likely to be skeptical of mandates, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, the vaccine itself. They're more likely to doubt the coronavirus even exists. They're more likely to doubt any official explanations for where it came from. Whereas people who were part of the Brahmin class or connected to it in some way are far more likely to say, believe the science, masks save lives, all the usual pieties, right? And so I don't think any of this can be explained purely by the coronavirus situation itself. The health issues and the scientific issues involved are secondary, while significant and important, are I think secondary to what motivates people's reactions. I think this is entirely tribal. That is how somebody reacts to the coronavirus, which is a medical issue, is going to be dependent on their tribal affiliation, and how much they trust elites and how much they trust professions and that kind of stuff. And that's true. It's not just even a left-right thing. Like the majority of the people I know who've refused to be vaccinated are Black people, and I know people who say, "Look, I know anti-Trump people, like who are usually either minorities or maybe some very far left people. They say, look, the vaccine was developed by the Trump administration. Who knows what's in that thing? So that's really where the anti-elite consensus is coming from. It's coming from the right. It's coming from the fringier sectors of the left, or the more marginal sectors of the left. And I think that's the way we have to understand, the whole sociology of this and the politics of this. I don't think that as far as the science, that's a whole separate question. Most people who really get wrapped up in this stuff, I don't think are even thinking about the science of it. I think they're just thinking about it from a cultural angle. And that's true of the anti-vax and pro-vax and pro and anti-mask people. The pro-mask, pro-vax people, they're the ones that they see the other side as just these uncouth proletarian louts and think, well, if they think it must be wrong. It's a purely tribal phenomenon.
All right, yeah. Before I hand it off to you, Swithun, I also forgot the most important part of libertarian class analysis: that the truckers are the producers, quote Hoppe and Spencer, and that the takers, the managerial elite, are just trying to loot from the producers. So that's the other bit of the libertarian class analysis. So what are your thoughts on that breakdown?
Oh, I was going to say, but Kevin Carson claims that they're leeching off the public purse because they're driving on public roads, and so actually they're a subsidized class of icky workers who are not sufficiently progressive. So that's the Carson take. On Keith's analysis, I think Keith's analysis is broadly correct. I mean, what are you going to remember with the whole coronavirus? The whole coronavirus stuff is it's inherently political from the beginning, because the lockdown and restrictions are political events, and so people will view the sort of severity of the situation based on whether they think the restrictions are justified. And because we live in basically a consequentialist society, well, if your intuition is that lockdowns are bad, then instantly you go, well, it's not that much of a problem, medically. And then, of course, if you think that they're justified, then of course you go the other way. So I do think that a lot of people, as it were, take one side or another on the on the severity of, well, what was the original version of the virus on those lines. What Keith mentions about the Brahmin class and the Dalits, it seems to be a tactic that elites have used in the past. I think Bertrand de Juvenel writes about this on Power, the high and low versus the middle. And this is what, for instance, this happens in sort of 16th century in England. So you start getting a proper sort of proto-centralized state under sort of the Tudor period in the late 15th, especially under Henry VIII in the early 16th century. And this is also the time of the rise of sort of the merchant class. And he very much aligns himself with the merchant class, to the detriment of the traditional aristocracy, to try to reduce their power because, well, this is a relatively recent dynasty. We want to establish political order. We don't want any rebellions from nobles with their own armies and stuff like this. So what we'll do is we'll try to enfranchise and improve the economic lot of what was becoming up the sort of the new sort of upper middle class, against the traditional aristocracy. And then, of course, the king has a nice new client base who are loyal to him because he gives out all the privileges and various things. So that seems entirely accurate. the interesting, I think possibly one of the interesting things would be in which situations has the high not ally with the low versus the middle. It's just a question of who's high and low and middle at any given point in time. Would be an interesting point. Although what I would say with the unanimity, as it would seem, of the upper middle class, there are a decent number of doctors in the upper middle class who are very much against the whole coronavirus stuff, and far more than who will speak out. I mean, so for instance, Matt Ridley, who's co-authored a book on the origins of the virus, has spoken to many scientists saying, do you think that it came out of a lab? It's like, yeah, it clearly came out of a lab. We say so in public? No, we won't. And especially when you've got in England, you've got the NHS that's the major employer in any medical related field. If you annoy them, you can lose your job. And you're going to find it very difficult to get rehired. In California, for instance, was it a story that the doctors would refuse to give out vaccine exemptions because they feared that they would have their license revoked to practice. So what you have, and this is, I think, one of the reasons, now that said, even if you did have a situation of unlicensed sort of free market medical care, I would still expect to a large extent that the upper middle class types would have been in support of restrictions and stuff. However, the unanimity amongst those in the medical field, I does seem to be largely as a result of medical licensure and the centralized medical systems. Because in the absence of that, they could just go, no, this is stupid, and it'll be fine, because they wouldn't lose their licenses, they wouldn't lose contracts and stuff. It wouldn't be an issue at all. And actually, of the upper middle class in the medical field, those are the ones who I think would probably be the more skeptical of them, because they would have more of a handle on how bad medically it actually was. There is absolutely no hope for the administration class. I mean, they would be all in it every time. It's like, oh no, this is a problem we can solve centrally. It must be good. This must be the solution because this is my job. And so therefore any problem must fulfill what I do well, which is central administration. Yes, I do think he's right. You have high, low versus middle, but in this particular case, the medical class are very much on side of it, mainly due, well, not mainly, but significantly due to the licensing situation.
So the other thing, at least with regards to the Canadian truckers, is some of the interviews that I've seen with representatives from the leadership from the movement have said that on the one hand, you'll see undercover cops try to stir up stuff and try to make the truckers look bad, or also undercover Antifa, stuff like that. And also, it does seem that, again, this is purely anecdotal, but we've seen on like social media, there seems to be a lot of police officers or law enforcement in Canada that are having this sort of moral conscious moment. Like, where do our loyalties really lie? Do they lie with the government that wants us to round up truckers, or does it lie with the truckers who are the Canadian people we swore to protect? And it does seem that there is this tension within the law enforcement. Are you going to be a toady for the Trudeau regime, or are you going to, keep your oath, so to speak, and protect the Canadian people? So that's interesting too, as far as like the crisis level of the regime. How reliable are law enforcement? How reliable are the armed forces? I mean, could we expect something like what happened in Moscow in 1991, where the Air Force general told the Politburo, if you don't stand down, we're going to bomb the Kremlin? I mean, that's a little extreme. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but what do you think, Keith?
Well, I do know they're worried about that because in recent times, I've increasingly seen commentary in the mainstream U.S. media, at least, questioning that issue. Now, most of this has come up in the aftermath of January 6th. Increasingly, I've seen military officers and pundits and politicians and others coming out and saying, well, what if Trump runs again in 2024? And what if he loses and attempts another coup? And maybe this time around, the military is going to back him up, because you have Trump loyalists in the military or something like that. So I do think that they are increasingly worried about the loyalty of the military to the state and wider political apparatus. And I think they're also worried about the fragmentation of the military into different political camps, where there's no longer a unified military. I've even seen generals. I've seen retired generals being interviewed on CNN talking about that, saying we've got to train our squad leaders and platoon leaders to weed out people in the military who aren't going to follow orders or something like that, because they might participate in a coup or something of that nature. Usually, and it's always about usually something to do with Trump. I do. Well, usually what overthrows a government is when its security forces are fragmented and can't hold any kind of unitary positions. When you have a crisis of legitimacy and different people claiming to be the legitimate government, and then nobody has the army on their side or the police or whomever. That is usually the sign that a regime is finished. That's what happened to the Soviet Union. That's what happened to Ceausescu. It's what happened to the DDR. And that happens a lot of places. So that's usually the final death knell for a regime. And the fact that they are concerned about this does show, I think, that they are concerned for their own position.
All right, Swithun.
I do think it's possible. I didn't watch it, but there was a major in the Canadian military who was like, yeah, this whole vaccine mandate stuff and all this corona thing is going a little bit far, or at least that was the summary, which is interesting because he seemed relatively senior, and this wasn't just some random private who was complaining about the policy. And I do think this is one of the reasons, as Keith has mentioned in the past, why the American military has tried to sort of trying to recruit ideologically loyal members of the military, which is why they're pushing the LGBT flag and all this other stuff to really rally around the diverse American military. So there's some pretty strong ideological stormtroopers to stop most of the sort of, because I think you probably recognize that the traditional recruiting basis for the American military are probably not very pro the general views that the current elites have, and so clearly then would be ideologically suspect and could turn. And so, of course, you don't want that to happen. So I do think that's a potential thing can happen. I remember seeing as well a video in Australia that there was like a policeman there who's like, yeah, I agree with you, this lockdown stuff's ridiculous, but I've got to do my job or I'll get fired. So here's the baton. I don't think he started beating him at that point. But it was like, we're going to have to, we need to stop this short, but obviously they haven't. So there just seems to be discontent there. And again, you probably expect that, especially in the military and the police. You traditionally had working class men in there who have been the people who, to a large extent, have been very much against the whole stuff. I mean, to a large extent, those people have continued to work because there's no way they can work anywhere else. They have to go around to people's houses and fix stuff. And it's like, well, kind of not a problem. We're kind of doing it. Why have we got all these restrictions on? So it is interesting to do that. I mean, I suppose as well, this might be one of the reasons why they're trying to professionalize all the military and all the sort of the more overtly repressive forms of the government. I mean, there's been a move to sort of like get most of the police in England, for instance, to have degrees because, oh, well, they need to be better trained. It's like, what, in sociology? Or other things like that. So I think it's just there primarily because they're going to get the right people through, and it's just a way. It's basically discrimination if it was used by people they don't like, this is what they'd be shouting about. And it's just a way of trying to increase the right type of people being in there who are going to be more compliant. I don't think they've got there yet, and I don't think they ever will, because I don't know if you have enough people who are willing to work in the police or the military who aren't. It's just a question of whether they can get the critical mass to avoid any uprisings like this. I don't really see it anytime soon, certainly not in England. Maybe more so in the US, where there's much more just where you could get. I'm pretty sure there was various cases in the whole lockdown restriction stuff whereby certain sheriffs or certain like local departments just said, we're just not going to enforce the stuff the state's done or the federal government do. We're just going to ignore it, and we'll just refuse to enforce anything. But that really doesn't happen in England because it was so much more centralized. Even though technically we've got independent local forces, but it doesn't really exist anymore. So it's certainly an issue. It's certainly a potential problem, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, at least not in England.
Right. Yeah. So I think we'll begin with closing statements. And I think what I'll say is whatever is going to happen right now with the trucker movement, with the anti-COVID protests, with the heavy-handed, desperate actions of the Western elites, I think we can basically say, though, this is big history. This is, I think, something, whatever's coming on the scale of 1789, on the scale of 1914, on the scale of 1917. Again, I think there's too many unknown variables that we can't really control for or predict to see how this goes. But I do think we're converging on an event or series of events that are that serious. Keith Preston.
Yeah, well, on that note, we talked about the Ukraine, I believe, last time, and that's the Ukraine situation, and that I think is an interesting scenario. It's one of the most dangerous things I've seen the American power elite do ever. That is trying to get to a direct confrontation with a nuclear armed power. I don't recall them doing that even in the Cold War, or even during the war on terrorism. Like even Henry Kissinger and Dick Cheney and guys like that had better sense than to get into a direct confrontation with Russia. But it's interesting that's going on now as well. I'm wondering what the next wave of unrest is going to be about. It looks like there's one thing that happens after another, and each time it just gets worse. Before the pandemic, we had all the street fights and between the left and the right, the Charlottesville and all that kind of stuff. And now in the last couple of years, we had all these things together. We've had the pandemic and everything related to it, economically and culturally and politically. And then we've had the George Floyd riots and the January 6th incident and the Biden-Trump election. So it looks like it just keeps on escalating. And I'm not sure where it's going to end up. It looks like this is something that's happening in all the developed countries. It's not just an American thing, although it seems to be more extreme in the United States than a lot of places. But increasingly, like I know a while back I was reading about riots in Holland, because over pandemic restrictions. I've spent time in Holland. I just could never picture the Dutch rioting over anything. It's like, the Dutch drive like 35 miles an hour on the freeway. So it's I do think that's interesting now that that elites are becoming that unpopular. And I think the pandemic has just kind of triggered a lot of things that were already there anyway. It's like, I don't think all of a sudden the pandemic came and all these conflicts started. I think it just kind of exacerbated lots of stuff that was already going on. And for a lot of people, this was just the final straw. And and as far as the thing about the military and the police, I do see an effort to weed out people in the military that they find unacceptable. And as long as the whole defund the police thing has been going on, I've always thought that was probably going to be used as a cover for creating a more centralized policing system in the United States. Where we say, well, we're not going to have policing by these local police departments that are full of redneck racist types and these despotic local sheriffs. Instead we're going to have this professional, educated police force organized by the federal government. That they're all going to be educated in social work practice and diversity training and cultural competence and all this kind of stuff. I could see that very easily being used. As a cover for policing. Although one thing I've noticed since Biden has been in office, the whole defund the police thing has kind of faded. I mean, Biden is actually trying to increase funding for for local policing. So that's another thing there. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know where this is going to go, but it does look like it's coming to a crisis point. Even to the point that I guess one of the most interesting things I've seen lately is that in the mainstream media in the U.S. on a regular basis, I'm seeing articles and news reports about the possibility of a coup, secession, civil war, breakup, in ways I never would have thought. I mean, the idea that stuff like that would be regularly discussed in the mainstream media 20 years ago would have been considered insanity. But now I'm increasingly seeing that kind of stuff. It's almost like all of a sudden the mainstream media has been reading attackthesystem.com or something like that.
All right, Swithun.
On the more narrow point with respect to truckers, the truckers won't back down. I don't think it's going to be in the interest of the Canadian government to push it too far. The issue is what do they do with the mandate? The easiest thing for the Canadian government is just to wait for as long as possible and go, oh, wait, the virus has just kind of disappeared now. It's kind of just like a cold. Oh, well, we don't need to do anything anymore, do we? Yeah, fine. And then claim, but the science has changed and leave it long enough. That'd be the easiest way out for it. But with the mandate in particular, that's difficult because they might still want you to have that later. So that would be my suspicion of what they'd attempt to do. But whether they will or not, I'm not entirely sure. But I generally concur with Keith's more overall comments.
All right. Thank you again, Keith and Swithun. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Presify Podcast, signing off.